We're good. Okay, so welcome back. We're continuing with Reish Nun Zayin Sif Ches. We're in the middle of Sif Ches. We actually completed a fair amount of it. In the Ramah, actually, we completed the entirety of it, but we didn't have a chance to read the comments of the Mishnah Berurah, which is our goal for today. So just to remind us where we were, we had talked about the idea that if a pot were touching the coals on the bottom side of the pot, if it's not touching the bottom, the bottom of the pot is not touching the coals, it's some sort of rack above the coals, and therefore there's nothing touching it on the bottom side. Then it's just a case of shehiyah, and Shulchan Aruch refers you to the laws that guide shehiyah in Reish Nun Gimel. And then he says, but if you put imnasan al hakidera kli rochav, if you put this wide thing around the vessel, around the pot, and it's not touching on the sides of the kidera, but it is a sort of insulation system. So mutar, we said it's permissible to kevin she'ena begadim nesunim ela al kli rachav she'ena nogeh b'tzidei, since the clothing are sitting on top of this vessel, which is surrounding the pot, but it's not touching the pot. Therefore, there's not a hatmana situation here because nothing is really touching the tzidei hakadera, the sides of the pot. So as the Shulchan Aruch writes, ein kan hatmana. There is no hatmana here. Nothing to see. Keep moving. It's not hatmana. That was what we had talked about last time. So we're going to read in the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll go piecemeal in the Mishnah Berurah. We're going to start 2 lines from the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch on. For me, it's page Kaf Tet. Where in the line it says v'chein muter lahaniach, which is right where the reference to Mem Dalet in the Mishnah Berurah appears. So the Shulchan Aruch here says v'chein muter lahaniach hakadera b'sanurim shalanu al yedei sheyitain besocha chaticha chasicha chaya. Okay, so you have here that it's permissible. Also, it's permissible to place in the pot. Place the pot in our ovens by placing a piece of raw meat. We've talked about this. We talked about it at the end of last week. We talked about this in the past. Placing raw meat is the ultimate heter when it comes to shehiyah, because the idea is that it's out of your mind, out of mind, out of sight. That you won't you won't play with the pot, touch the pot, bother with the coals, because this is really for Shabbos morning, and by that point, you won't want to play with the coals anyways, because then you risk burning the food. So, as long as it's permissible, as long as the pot is not touching the coals. All right, even if, let's say, you cover the opening of the oven with clothing, so you create a situation of insulation, but it's not touching on all sides of the pot. Since the clothing are not touching the pot itself, lav hatmanahi. It's not called hatmana, v'shari, and it's permissible. Let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah Mem Dalet and Mem Hey. Okay, so Mem Dalet, the Mishnah Berurah writes, Perush, ad hashta myri le'inyan kira. Until now, we were talking about a kira, that type of oven with the 2 holes on top. And now, and now we're saying even in a tanur, right? Not even just a kira, but even a tanur, the Talmudic oven, which had the 1 hole on the top and had a narrow. It became more narrow from bottom to top. This oven, thus concentrating the heat at the top with the opening. So he says, even now, we're explaining that even in a tanur, it is permissible to place the pot Erev Shabbos, even if it's not garuf v'katum. Okay, so you have not raked the coals, you haven't put ashes on them. Kevin shenosin b'chaticha chaya lo chayshinan lechitu. This is what I was saying before. You want to make a cholent in the oven, right? You go ahead because if you put it in right, particularly if you put it in right before Shabbos starts. So what are we worried about? You're not going to play with anything. This is going to be ready Shabbos lunch. And that's what they're describing here, even in a tanur. And I told you that the poskim, many of the poskim, my rabbi included, consider our ovens, which can get to very high temperatures, extremely high temperatures, are compared to the Talmudic tanur. But here you can make, you can, as long as there's a piece of raw meat, even if it's not garuf v'katum, you can go ahead and do this because we're not worried he will stoke the coals. Lo chashinan lechitui. And also if it's fully cooked, the ilav hachi asur mishum shehiyah, because if not, then it will be a shehiyah problem. Okay. This is at the review of Reish Nun Gimel, all the laws of shehiyah and sif aleph. Da'af shakadera kula nesuna besoch hatanur. Umechase pia tanur gam kein begodim. Ubevada mosif hevel ayedechom hatanur. Afilu hache ein sham hatmana al ze v'shari. Kevan she'ena begodim nogin bakadera. So he says here, even if the pot is placed inside the oven, and then the opening of this oven, which is, again, it's not exactly like our setting. In our setting, right, they have a door, the oven goes up and down, from the side. Even if the opening here was on the side, the idea they put a clay layer, which is in addition to whatever may have been the daf that covered it, the board that may have covered the opening of the oven. So you would have put this clay covering on the oven, and the pot is inside the oven. And of course, it's for sure increasing heat because of the intense heat of the oven. And now you're insulating the heat of the oven even so, ein shame hatmana alze. It's not called hatmana. Why is it not called hatmana? And it's permissible because the bigadim, the clothing, are not touching the kedera. Hatmana only is when it's enveloped on all four sides. Even if you create a situation of insulation, like inside an oven, that's not called hatmana. And therefore, you're not subject to the laws of hatmana, you're subject to the laws of shehiyah, which we've learned, but not hatmana. That's not relevant in that scenario. Sif katan memhei, v'hu shelo tehei, tehakader no gas bagechom. This is talking about that the coals are not touching the bottom of the pot. Di'im hayu shuleha nogim bagechom. If the bottom of the pot is touching the coals, svir le'la mechaber. The mechaber holds the mecham hazeh gufa mikri matmin b'davar mamosif hevel v'asur. That is called hatmana, the b'davar hamosif hevel, and it would be forbidden. Now, I assume what he means here is that it's covered on all the other sides. Within the oven, you cover it. I don't even know how this works because I don't know why you're putting bigodim in an oven. That seems like a bad idea. Reminiscent of a Seinfeld episode where Kramer tried to reheat his shirts by putting them in the pizza oven at Paisanos. Okay. V'harama, again, I'm not sure here what what's going on top of this. This is it has to be covered on all sides. It can't just be the coals on the bottom. And now we call this hatmana. I believe it would have to be covered on all the other sides as well. V'harama sham the Hagan, the Rama in his gloss, svir he holds the al yidei zeh lo chashiv hatmana. He says, no, that's not called hatmana. Now, why is it not called hatmana according to him? He says, ayin sham. And I believe it's going to make more sense soon when we talk about, hold on. So I think the reference here, I struggle when I was preparing this too. I believe the reference here is to the idea that the Ramah is going to say that even if you have hatmana inside the oven, it's not a problem if there's a clay covering over the oven, because the whole point is that you might stoke the coals, but that I covered it with clay. So I'm not going to open up this oven. I have a reminder for myself. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to mess with it. We're going to sit here at the very bottom, actually, of this page. Very bottom. So the Ramah, I believe, is going to say, and we'll see that in a moment, that hatmana is not an issue in that situation because the oven is effectively sealed with this extra covering, which is a reminder, which no one wants to break, because then you're going to let all the cold air in, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no incentive at all to stoke the coals. And therefore, even if there is hatmana going on inside the oven, not a problem.
I don't get that, because if it's covered on all sides, by definition, that's hatmana.
Right. So that Ramah is going to carve out an exception in a moment. We're going to see it in a moment. He's going to carve out an exception in that situation. And
that's not covered. The pot's not covered.
Yeah, it is. You said that pot is covered with cloth, right?
I believe so. Otherwise, I'm not sure why this is. Unless he's. Hold on. So let's back up here. 1 second. Hold on. I'm having a thought. This case, right? We're saying this scenario too is not considered hatmana. What is the scenario? Let's redraw it again. The Shulchan Aruch draws the picture that if it's in the oven and there's a raw piece of meat and the pot is not touching the coals at the bottom of the oven, even though the opening of the oven is covered with clothes. So it's actually important here. So I retract what I said before. Maybe it is only touching the coals in the case of the Mishnah Berurah. And the clothing are on the covering of the oven.
Right, so not on the pot.
On a box, basically, where the coals are touching the food in addition. So for some reason here, not for some reason, which is
Is it called touching the food or not?
in the Shulchan Aruch's case, it's not, but the Mishnah Berurah is inferring that if it were touching the coals, even though the clothing are not touching on the other sides, they're covering they're on top of the clay covering of they're on top of the opening of the kedera, of the oven. There's no clay actually at this point. The Ramah is the one who's going to bring up the clay. But there is a covering for there's a covering of clothing on the opening of the oven. So in that scenario where there's their clothing on top of the oven, pot is touching the coals, Mishnah Berurah infers it would be a problem according to the Shulchan Aruch, even though it's not touching. So it's a bit of a chidush that if it's touching on the bottom side and then you cover the opening of the oven on the other sides, the Mishnah Berurah infers that the Shulchan Aruch had a problem with this, and he says the Ramah would not have a problem with this because he says it's not considered hatmana because it's not touching on all sides. That's the explanation here. That's
so the fabric is on the pot or on the oven itself?
It's on the opening of the oven. The coals are touching the pot, but the fabric is not touching the pot. That's when it's the chidush here, the Mishnah Berurah's inference of the Shulchan Aruch is that it's a problem. The Shulchan Aruch draws up the case saying, "Vehu shelo teheh hakeder nogas b'gechalim," as long as it's not touching the coals. It's a very good inference, I think. He would have added that if it wasn't important. Touching the coals, not touching the coals shouldn't make a difference if all the other sides are untouched. So he makes a differentiation here between it's touching the coals and perhaps right. And if you go back even to the last line of the Mishnah Berurah in the previous statement, if it's in the oven and it's completely covered in clothing, the oven is, even though it's for sure adding heat. So I retract my Seinfeld reference, sorry. There it's not called hatmana because the begadim are not touching the pot. But then once you touch the coals to the pot, and then you have clothing covering, that's too much of a hatmana-like situation, even though every other scenario we've defined hatmana is always touching. And even the Ramah agrees that it has to be touching. It's not the gzeira. The gzeira was touching on all sides. The Shulchan Aruch seems to extend this idea to even this scenario where it's touching the coals, and then you have a clothing covering that's blocking all the holes of the oven that are available.
Whenever I'm confused about this, I think of hatmana not as insulation, but as concealing or hiding.
Right. That's what the word means.
Right. So when you translate it as hiding, even here, it makes perfect sense.
Right. It's hiding.
It's not a question of the heat. It's a question of whether you could see the pot.
Right. Right. And so the Shulchan Aruch is saying, if it's in the oven and not touching anything, okay, I'll let it go. If it's touching the coals at the bottom, and you already have this intense heat, situation, and now you've hidden it. Very good, Steve. Right. So then forget it. We're not allowing this. But again, the Ramah allows this. Yes.
Is there holes underneath the pot where the gechalim is?
If there are, then the Shulchan Aruch would say it's fine. If there's like a rack, it's not touching. If it's touching directly, then it's a problem.
No, I'm saying, is there like those two holes under the oven?
The two holes on the top of the oven. There's probably a place to put coals at the bottom of the oven, but I don't think there are any extra holes down there. Meaning, like
is it a plate? Gechalim is underneath, and then you have the pot on top. Is that how it works?
No. I think it's touching the gechalim. Meaning the actual pot is touching the gechalim. Right? No. There's no break between them, like a metal board. That's not the way he describes it, at least. Okay, now let's take a look at the Ramah and understand the Ramah's approach to this. So the Ramah says, "V'hatmana she'osim b'medino seil," and I starts talking about his own hatmana situation in his land. Shematminim b'tanur, we do hatmana in the tanur, v'tachen pi tanur b'tit. So we do this. It's touching the coals on the bottom, presumably. Otherwise, they don't have to talk about here. And or maybe it's not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's touching. Bottom line is, they put food in the oven. They hide it, and they put it in there. They cover the opening of the tanur with clay, but it sounds like shemat minim betanur, but they do a hatmana in the oven, right? That sounds like the Seinfeld reference I mentioned before. Sharei lekuliyam, because everybody thinks that that's fine. This is quoting the Or Zarua on the Trumas Hadeshen. Ukamotion Yisbar Le'el b'Siman Reish Nun Daled, as we explained earlier in Reish Nun Daled, Yisbar Le'Kaman so Siman Reish Nun Tes, as we'll explain at the end of Reish Nun Tes, that it's all fun and games, it's all no problem, good or good, not a problem. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here. He gets into this case. Mem Vav. Hine le'inyan hatmana ein sarich klal tit b'tit gamler harama. He says, with regards to hatmana, you don't need the clay covering, even according to the Ramah. You don't need it. Ela de balomar de b'tiach shari b'chol inyan. Says, look, at the end of the day, the Ramah thinks if it doesn't touch on all sides, it's not a problem anyways. But what is he trying to say? He's trying to say, the Ramah is trying to tell you that everyone would agree, even the Shulchan Aruch, who's more machmir than me, would agree that if you cover it with clay, everyone thinks it's fine. Even if you have a, hatmana situation, where you have it touching the coals on the inside, and then you cover the oven with the clothing. If you put a clay covering over top of all of it, even if there's no raw meat, shabasar, and it's still not cooked, it's at the beginning of being cooked. So it's a shahiyah problem too. Where we would say that if it's not fully cooked, so at the beginning of being cooked, we would say it's prohibited to do this. In this scenario, if it's not garu fekatum, if the oven has not been, coals have not been raked, or their ashes have not been sprinkled over top of the coals. Uvetiach, but if you take the very same scenario and you cover it with clay, the oven, the door, or the holes that open up the oven, shari, it all becomes good to go. Vida, and we should know the bevor le'el, we explained earlier, the dafka bevasar shu kishu chai, but he wants to clarify now about the raw meat. The raw meat only helps. He says here, the dafka bevasar kishu chai, when raw meat, ein bo chashash chitui. That's when there's no fear of stoking the coals. Because they're stoking the coals won't help get the food. It won't be ready to be eaten at night. Aval pashtida, if you have a pashtida, that's our bareka kind of food where you have a pocket inside a dough. Oh, mine kitnio, so you have different types of legumes. Oh, mine botzek, different types of dough. So you have bread, whatever. Mimahar in lehizbasha. You can, very quickly bake or cook that on Friday night. Thank you. It could be ready. Even if you put them right before Shabbos starts. The dough is raw. The legumes are raw. The bareka has not been cooked one bit. We are worried that once it's dark, you will stoke the coals. Because you might do this in order to hasten the cooking for it to be consumed at your evening meal. So what do you need? You need, in those situations of raw, non-meat foods, you need a clay covering on your oven, which was the ultimate reminder you will not bust it open, because it will be mazik the food in some ways, because it'll bring a bunch of cold air in with it as well. So there's a big trade-off here that no one will be comfortable with, if they're acting out of habit. They will not just reach into the oven out of habit and forget and stoke the coals. He says here one more thing. In places like ours, where we don't cover our ovens with clay, you cannot put it in the oven close to dark. Unless there is a raw piece of raw meat. So you have a cholent that is a vegetarian cholent. Then it's very important that you cover the knobs before Shabbos starts, or at the very least that it's cooked to the point of machal ben drusai before Shabbos. Because if there's no meat in there, that heter doesn't exist, as we've mentioned before. As I just mentioned, unless it's cooked to the point of machal ben drusai, third or half cooked, or you do grufo ktuma, right? You cover the coals with ashes. As we've talked about and written in Reish and Gimel. So this is just a little bit of a review about the whole topic of raw meat versus raw other foods. The heter only exists with raw meat, not raw vegetables, not any kind of other kind of raw food. Those do cook fairly quickly. Meat does take a while to cook.
What about potatoes, raw potatoes? They don't cook very quickly and you cannot eat them raw.
Right, but the question is, if I put raw potatoes to cook on Friday night, I'm thinking about the crock pot. The potatoes might be ready at some point in the evening. The meat will not be ready until maybe the middle of the night. Maybe the morning. It's really it's ready to be consumed if it's raw going into Shabbos. I mean, potatoes for sure don't take as long as meat. Am I wrong? I agree with you. They take a long time, particularly if you don't cut them up. Right? If you cut it up into small pieces, it's not so. It doesn't take as long. But even if you put a whole potato in there, it would. I would guess it's. I put it this way: if you have raw meat that's cut up, which does cook faster than a bigger piece of meat, undoubtedly, I would believe that a small piece of meat takes longer than a small piece of potato. And a whole potato takes longer than a whole, steak, whatever it is, the meat that you're putting in the cholent. So there seems to be no heter carved out here for anything except for meat. That potatoes, despite their characteristics, get lumped with the rest of the vegetables and the legumes and whatnot. So I hear you. I hear that's a good point. Potatoes are definitely they take a long time to cook compared to other vegetables. I don't think that there's an exception there. Okay, Mem Zayin, Shari Lakuli Alma, if it's covered in clay, the Ramah said everybody agrees it's okay. Even so, yesh omrim, of course, as a yesh omrim. There's always another opinion in Judaism. If you're going to put it in the oven and you're going to cover it with the clay on the outside of the oven, please be careful, this Yesh Omrim says, that at least the coals shouldn't be touching on all sides. Implying that the opinion of the Ramah is that even if it was Hatmana inside the oven, if you cover it with clay, so you did Hatmana in the oven, and then you covered it with clay on the outside of the oven, no problem, because no one's going to stoke the coals. So therefore, the Gezerah is not a problem at this point. But there's an Yesh Omrim opinion that says, please don't do that inside the oven, at the very least on all the sides. It's the definition of Hatmana B'davar HaMosif Hevel. You put coals on all sides of it. That's the definition, literally, of Hatmana. So don't start telling me, well, I covered it in clay, so now I don't have to worry about the rest of the whole thing. So the Machmir opinion here says, because of the coals itself, it's a problem. But there are those who are lenient. The hatuach betit, because there is the clay covering. And how are you going to stoke the coals? The whole point is we don't want you to stoke the coals. So there's no chance. Or Zarua paskins that the lenient opinion. And the Mishnah Berurah's famous words, it's good to be machmir, ideally. And he gives you another reason to be machmir. Why else should we be machmir? Because what happens? The coals will remain, will be burning and glowing till the next morning, ad lamachar. Now you're going to try to take the food out, right? Comes in the morning, you take the food out. Can't get the pot out. So he's giving you a reason to be machmir because it's practical also not to be machmir. It's practical to be machmir because how are you going to get into the coals? If the coals are burning hot, how are you going to stick your hand in there and grab the pot out? He says, doesn't make sense. Just be machmir. And don't put the coals all around the pot for practical reasons. And he said, perhaps also here there's a fear of you'll move the coals around and it'll cause a havara situation where you'll reignite the flame a little bit. But I'll call upon him. Nevertheless, the makom shalonohagu lahatiach hastima betit, when there's in a place where the practice is not to cover the oven in clay. For sure, you cannot put the pot inside gecholim, inside the coals in the oven. Even if it's fully cooked. That's the definition of atmana. You're hiding it in the davar hamosif hevel, the ultimate davar hamosif hevel, which is coals, where you can actually stoke the coals, and that's where the whole gezerah originated from. So, in our situation, in our world, we don't have this kind of clay covering. Our ovens are not locked away from us. And I know someone's going to bring out the point of what you can lock your oven. I don't know if mine does, but I remember we had this old oven in my house where when you locked it, there was a lever and you had to pull the lever across to lock it when I grew up. That was only used when it was, I think, self-cleaning or whatever. But I don't even know if they make those now. But bottom line is, that's not something that we have so much in our scenario. Okay, one more comment here, and then we'll stop. We'll do the large comment next week. Let's stop here because mitzvah lahatmin is really the next time. That got into the whole discussion about apikorsis, and it's taken very seriously here in the Mishnah Berurah about the hot food. But you don't have to have hot food. Bottom line is like you can have cold food if you like cold food. If hot food damages you, it offends you, it hurts your stomach, so you can have cold food. But we're going to see that that's not. If it's not the case, though, you really need to try to have something hot. So that people don't think you're an apikoros. So don't worry. Even so, we will save you from. If you don't like hot food, we'll save you from heresy. There are some workarounds here against heresy, and I gave you the background. He's going to give you the background here that the tzdukim, the Sadducees, they used to say that there was no fire allowed on Shabbos, and therefore, if you didn't have hot food, you were suspected of being a Sadducee. They were against the Prushim, the Rabbinites. So we'll talk about that next week. And we'll talk about the next siman, about allowing you to place cold things on top of hot things on Erev Shabbos. It's a very short siman, Reish Nun Ches. All right, have a wonderful day, everybody, and our learning should be a aliyah and for the neshamos and those who've served and lost their lives in the IDF. And I also wish everybody a Chag Sameach tonight to enjoy Yom Ha'atzmaut, and can't wait to celebrate.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
take
you.
care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Take